Kind of question about, is the economist's definition of diminishing returns related to production, cost, or both? And I was saying it's kind of both. The basic idea, going back to the optimization chapter, is that you do an activity and you expect to get some benefit from it. And the idea of diminishing returns is that as you continue to do something, as you continue to engage in that activity, then usually the benefits eventually start to decrease. They might increase for a while. You might have this, as you do more of an activity, the amount of benefits that you get from it might actually start to increase. So if you only have one of something, it might give you a certain level of happiness. If you have a second unit of those things, you might get even more happiness than the first unit gave you. The second unit itself might give you more happiness than the first unit gave you. So your marginal happiness is increasing. But after a while, the additional benefit that you get from continuing to consume this thing or make this choice eventually starts to decrease, and it can eventually become negative. So we kind of mostly refer to it in the sense of the additional benefit that you're getting from something starts to decline after time. And again, you can use that idea of diminishing returns in different contexts. So you can do it in terms of eating French fries. Eventually, the happiness that you get from the additional happiness that you get from eating French fries is going to start to decrease. But anywhere that you can identify the benefit of a decision, then you can usually say that the law of diminishing returns starts to set in. So here's this idea of diminishing marginal product, where we said that when you continue to hire people, that eventually, even though the marginal product may initially start to increase because you're going through what we call this teamwork phase, eventually that marginal product starts to decrease. And it starts to go down. And again, that could still be happening where your total output is increasing, but it's just going to be increasing at a decreasing rate. I mean, the idea of diminishing marginal product, diminishing return, is to look at the marginals, whether they are increasing or decreasing, not necessarily whether they are positive or negative. So in the table I have in slide 8, you can see that I sort of highlighted some of the rows, this beige color, and then another set of the rows, this pinkish color. And that's because up to, when labor is increasing up to 3 workers, you can look at the marginal product column and see that the marginal product is continuing to increase. And I'm getting these marginal product values from this equation here. So if you wanted to type those into Excel, you could recreate this table. After that,
we can't see your screen.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm not sharing my screen. Okay, so we're here on slide 8. I'm gonna pull up my participants list in my chat window also, so I don't miss anything. So from 0 to 3 workers, you see the marginal product is increasing. It's getting larger than the previous one. Once you get past 3 workers, then the marginal product starts to decrease. It's still positive, and you can look at the total product column and see that it is still going up. So the total product is still increasing, but we would say that you've sort of reached that point of diminishing returns between the 3rd and 4th worker. Once you get to the 4th worker, you know that diminishing returns has set in because the marginal product is decreasing. It's not as large as the previous units were, the previous numbers of labor were. Obviously, once marginal product becomes negative, then you can say, yeah, definitely things are getting worse once we get to number 10. But you can even say that diminishing return sets in much earlier than that, like in worker number 4, because the marginal product starts to decrease. So again, technically, the idea of diminishing returns relates to the benefit you get from something. And in this case, if you're thinking of hiring workers as the company, the benefit of hiring workers is that they can produce additional output for you. So the idea of diminishing returns has me look at hiring workers and then looking at their marginal product, each individual worker's marginal product. And so again, it sets in right, between the 3rd and 4th worker. So it's definitely the 4th worker. And I'm assuming though, so it specifically relates to marginal product, but also just near the end. Yeah, near the end here, I say that short run costs and production are related. Producing incurs costs. So there is a relationship between those two concepts. So since we said that the idea of diminishing returns mostly relates to marginal product, then you could say, well, I can figure out where we are in terms of increasing returns or diminishing returns by looking at marginal product. But since these things are related, you could also kind of infer what's happening to marginal product if all the information you have is just marginal cost. If all you have is marginal cost information, you can still say something about where the company is in terms of its diminishing returns or increasing returns. You can infer what's happening to marginal product if all you have is marginal cost information. Because if a company is being efficient, if it's going through this teamwork phase, which was periods where marginal product is increasing, I think that's how I define my teamwork phase over here. Teamwork phase, more L improves productivity or marginal product. This shouldn't, I hope no one sees this as like productivity divided by marginal product. I'm just using it as productivity or marginal product, either way you want to refer to it. So the teamwork phase is, as I said, the more L leads to higher marginal product. So again, that'll be my beige area here. So if I can see that marginal product is increasing, I say, well, I'm in the teamwork phase, I'm in the increasing returns phase. If I'm in the purple range, then I'm in the decreasing marginal product area, or I'm in the crowding phase, I'm in the diminishing returns phase. But again, you could also look at the cost side too. And so if we are being efficient in the beige region and being less efficient or inefficient in the pinkish region, then that would have to sort of feed through to when you're looking at costs. So when you see that we're being efficient when marginal product is increasing, then that efficiency should not only be seen on the production side, but it should also be seen on the cost side. So, I mean, efficiency, you could describe efficiency both in terms of greater productivity and in terms of decreasing costs. You can say you're efficient if either or both of those things is happening. Our company is efficient either if we're producing more output more easily, or if we're producing more cheaply. More cheaply? That doesn't sound right. If it's requiring lower costs to produce, or if both of those things are happening at the same time, you would call that efficiency. So if you are noticing that your marginal costs are decreasing, it's cheaper and cheaper for you to produce output, then you can say, okay, that seems like we're being efficient, and that should correspond with your marginal product increasing. So you could say if either of these things in this first bullet point are happening, then you could say, well, we're in the teamwork phase, we're in the increasing returns phase of production. If either of the things are happening in the second bullet point, then you could say, well, this seems to be that these are two different text boxes. This seems to be a situation where, well, we have decreasing marginal product, so it seems like we're in the crowding phase. And crowding means that you're being less productive, but you're also producing output at a higher cost. The crowding makes people less productive, and it's more expensive to produce output if your workers can't get as much done. So if you see marginal product decreasing or if you see marginal cost increasing, then you would say, well, we must be in the crowding phase or in the diminishing returns phase. So either of those should point you in the same direction. All right. And, anyone else? I thought there was another verbal question that someone had, sort of a typed question.
Yeah, Professor, I have a question on one of the exam questions yesterday regarding larger firms, why they're surviving. I think it has to do with, I want to say it was avoiding the economies of scale, or I couldn't remember exactly the verbiage, but the longevity for the large firms. Could you explain that?
Graded thing, I can't say too much, and I have to confess that I'm not sure which one that is. Was it it ended yesterday, so that was a self-assessment? No, self-assessment for today. So it was one of the...
No, that was from one of the videos, video 2.
Well, let me stop my share and see if I can, because then you won't be able to see my screen. Because I don't need other people taking screen captures of me looking through the quiz. If I can refresh my memory on that. If it's that kind of question, it's probably video quiz 2. If you remember that it was the first one, let me know, but it sounds like a...
Yeah, it was one of the last questions after video 2.
Let's see here. there's one about, again, I don't want to say too much because it gets recorded and people can watch these videos and get help with their quizzes next time before even taking it. So I don't want to say too much.
Okay.
Cops are coming after one of you. I'm not sure who it is. I hear police sirens in the background.
Oh, sorry, that's Honolulu's finest.
Okay. Okay. Well, let's do this instead. On a completely different topic. There's this concept of these different long-run cost curves. And as I mentioned, certain types of products, certain types of industries exhibit different types of production. So you might, and I may have gone through this sort of setup in the video itself, but well, I was going to say you may have wondered this, but I don't know how many people sit and think about things like this. We're familiar with these huge companies, Target, Walmart, Amazon, and I think people can sometimes think, well, all companies must be like that. All companies must aspire to get to this size. And you can think of, different companies that are big, that are in different industries, I suppose. So you have GM is a very large company and it makes cars. And Amazon is very big and it sells products, but it also does a lot of cloud sort of services, which I think is where it gets most of its bread and butter these days. Not necessarily selling books anymore, which is how it started. But Amazon seems to be in a completely different industry than GM is. GE sells light bulbs and other electronics things. So I think a lot of people think that if they have experience with industries like this, they just think, well, every business then must at least have the ability or the capacity to reach that size. So if I have a barber shop, then what's to stop me from having a barbershop billion-dollar company that is worldwide and cuts hair in all corners of the globe? Hot dog stands, there should be these big multinational global billion-dollar hot dog companies, hot dog stands companies. Again, so I think people would sort of have this impression, and you might get this impression if you're just looking at some of the earlier slides where it's like, oh, here's how businesses operate, and they've got these ISO quants, ISO costs, and you come back here and you say, well, here's what production looks like, and companies always have cost curves that look like this. But one of the nice things about the latter part of this chapter is to say, well, some industries differ as to how their production behaves. So if you take an industry, you can get these pictures of its long-run total cost curves, long-run average cost, long-run marginal cost. But if you look at different companies or different industries, they'll exhibit different properties. Some of them will have their long-run average cost curve, which is the blue one in slide 11. Oh, I stopped sharing. I'll go back to sharing. If you look at slide 11 of the part 2 set of slides, let me go back first. So as I said, you can envision each company is going to have a long-run total cost, long-run average cost, long-run marginal cost curve. But again, if you were to look at different long-run average cost curves from different industries, you would notice they would look different. Some of them would look, like the early diseconomies, the way I'm labeling it over here on the left. They might look in the middle like these extended economies, where they might have this range of constant long-run average cost, this flat portion at the bottom of the valley there. The big differences between these two, the early diseconomies and the extended economies of scale. Because what you'll notice with this early diseconomies of scale, companies are trying to, in the long run, they're trying to minimize their costs. They're trying to drive their costs down. It doesn't do, we said before that companies want to maximize their profits. That's true. But as far as long-range planning goes, if you're planning for the long run, there's only so much you can do in terms of the prices that people are willing to pay for your product. So if I sell something, anyone who's run a small business can certainly attest to this, that there are some things that are under the company's control. We can decide how many employees we want, what sorts of machinery we want, what prices we might want to try setting. That doesn't mean that customers are going to be willing to pay that price. So there are some things that the company doesn't really have a whole lot of control over as far as the market goes, the demand side of the market. But on the supply side, the technology that it uses, the workers that it uses, the firms have a lot more control over those things. So as far as long-range planning goes, the company is going to be more concerned about the cost side of things, the supply side of things, as opposed to the demand or the revenue side of things. So as far as planning goes, we're going to try to say, well, if we want to be as profitable as possible, then the way for us to usually go about doing that is to try to get our costs as low as we can. And so companies are going to try to figure out, at what level of output is going to allow, what level of output is going to allow us to minimize our long-run average costs. So that's kind of the idea of where companies want to try to go. And if you remember, the long run is that period of time where you can adjust not only your amount of output and your short-run inputs, like the number of workers you're using, the amount of electricity you're using, but you also, your variable inputs, but you can also vary your what used to be fixed inputs. So the number of buildings you have, some of these more these longer-term capital projects. I had a C word in there, but it wasn't working. These sort of longer-run capital projects, like the number of buildings you have, the number of plants that you operate, and so we try to set those things in a way that will allow us to reach this minimum point on the long-run average cost curve. But as I said, different industries have different points where that minimum is met. Some industries have what we call early diseconomies of scale, where they go through they reach their minimum point at fairly low levels of output, relatively low levels of output for each firm. So each firm is going to have a picture like this. And again, if you have an industry or a firm that's experiencing this early diseconomies of scale, that means that pretty early on, at pretty low levels of output, they already reached this portion where their long-run average cost curve is starting to increase. So the firm says, well, it's ideal for us to get to the minimum point of this thing, and we don't really want to produce beyond that. We don't want to grow beyond that point, because if we do that, if we grow beyond that point and continue to produce more and more output, our costs are just going to go up. Which again, I think is one of the things that kind of escapes a lot of people when they think about companies or they complain about businesses. They'll say, well, businesses are just greedy and they want to grow to be as big as they can be. I suppose in one sense that could be true, but most businesses realize that, being as big as we can be it would mean that we would have a lot of customers, but it might also mean that we have really high costs. And so there could be a reason why we don't really want to be very big if we're in one of these industries that exhibits this early diseconomies of scale. We really want to just produce output that'll put us right here at the bottom, at this low point on our long-run average cost. And we don't want to grow beyond that. If your long-run average cost curve looks like this, then it is beneficial for these businesses to remain small. There's no reason why a business would want to get bigger than this. They want to stay at that minimum point. And again, you can kind of envision, hopefully that makes sense just in terms of the graph and the picture, but I think some people are like, well, how do you translate this picture into the real world? You can imagine a certain type of business where they reach this kind of, happy point where their costs are relatively minimized. And if you ask them to expand, they might say, well, then it's going to be really difficult for us to, we have to have managers go around to the different branches that we have, and it becomes really expensive to monitor everything that's going on. Some companies can do that relatively easily, relatively painlessly, but there are some industries and some types of businesses that it's harder to do that. So again, when that happens, it's to the benefit of a firm in this industry to stay small. You go to the middle one, the extended economies of scale. And again, these businesses, they also want to be at the minimum point of their long-run average cost curve. And for them, that is not reached until you achieve an output that is very large. So again, people will criticize companies in all types of situations, but they'll say, well, these companies are too big, they're just too massive, and there's nothing good that can come from that. We should break those companies up so that everything can be smaller. We need to go back to these mom and pop types of stores. Okay, a mom and pop store might be a really good idea if the industry looks like this. If you have if you have this minimum point of long-run average cost that is met very early on, then a mom and pop store might be actually the most efficient most efficient form of business, form of a firm for this type of industry. But if you're over here, in an industry that has costs that look like this. And again, the shape of the cost curve is usually going to reflect kind of the underlying technology of production in that industry. It's not like a business just wakes up one day and says, hey, let's move our average cost curve over here. Let's move it over here. It usually reflects the technology and the type of things that are being produced, the types of inputs and resources that the companies are using. So again, if you said we want there to be much smaller companies in this industry, you could do that. You could force each firm to be relatively small, produce a relatively small amount of output. But doing that is going to lead to their costs being really high. And if people are comfortable with, buying a product whose costs are really high, who probably are going to try to push their prices up too, to make sure they can hopefully break even. Or if they can't push their prices up, and if another entity is forcing their prices to be low, then those companies are going to be taking losses. So again, if you're trying to force businesses in this extended economies picture to be small, if you're forcing them to be small, then they're going to be very expensive, very high cost. They become efficient by being very big. And I think I think people sort of think those two ideas are mutually exclusive. How can you be efficient if you're really big? I see all these big companies, they don't seem to be efficient. They have these places, these stores all over the place, managers all over the place. They just seem really big and unwieldy. I don't see how they can be efficient. Well, they can be efficient in the sense that they reach this minimum average cost at a very high level of output. So again, you probably are familiar with, mom and pop barbershops. You just have, you have chain haircutting places, I know. But, in most towns, you probably find a good handful of barbershops that are fairly independently owned. And there may be, a company that has 2 or 3 different barbershops in that town. But aside from the chain stores, there's a good smattering of mom and pop barbershops. You don't really see a lot of mom and pop airlines or aircraft companies. Hey, we're going to produce jet engines at mom and pop aircraft, and we're going to make 3 a year, and we're going to sell them to whoever. No, because those kinds of industries generally become efficient, reach their most efficient production when they can become very large. So there's Boeing and Airbus. I think that's really the only 2 major jet manufacturers. There's probably more. Elon Musk is probably making jets at this point.
Would that be an example of auto industry, that extended economies?
I would think so. Because if you just think about, again, a lot of these costs have to reflect the underlying technology that's required to produce a product like that. So you could think of someone putting a car together if it's just like a sole proprietorship. So, this is Tim Shaughnessy's car manufacturer, and I'm going to make cars for you. I could maybe spit out 1 car every 3 years. I couldn't, because I don't know anything about cars. But if I knew about it and I was just going to make them in my own garage, then again, I could probably make one every couple of years, maybe to the standards that would be required of people buying new cars today. And the reason it would take me forever is because I just don't have all the tools and all the machinery and equipment. To be able to produce cars at a decent scale and at a decent price, it requires, huge factories, huge amount of machinery. So the capital required to do that is just massive. Once you get all that stuff, though, once you get all that machinery and that capital, it becomes pretty cheap to produce a car, relatively speaking. Again, just one person in his garage, it would be very expensive to do that. So yeah, the car industry, the car manufacturing industry is probably another good example of an industry that has these extended economies of scale. The idea of economies of scale is, as opposed to diseconomies of scale, economies of scale is where your long-run average cost curve is falling, and diseconomies, so over in this left-hand side, they do have economies of scale for a little while. So if you just had 1 barber chair, you might be able to find yourself more efficient if you have 2 or 3 of them in your little shop. You could become more efficient by having 2 or 3 barbers there. And so you could push your costs down. If you started super, super small, which is 1, you could push your costs down by adding a couple chairs there. Once you get past that, you wouldn't want to have 35 chairs in your little, 10 by 30 barbershop. So you start becoming more and more inefficient as time goes on. Over here, again, the car company, the aircraft producer becomes more and more efficient as they grow. Even there, though, you could talk about a situation of the car industry or the car company being too big, growing to the point where, well, they're just they're hitting this diseconomies range of their long-run average cost. The third one is not really, I mean, it's just kind of a specific case, I guess, where you have this flat range. So you might expect some companies to be relatively small. You might also expect some companies to be relatively big if they both sort of have this minimum average cost that isn't really all that different from being relatively small this end of it versus relatively big on this end of it. So,
Dr. Shaughnessy, in your lectures, you use the automotive industry as a good example of the extended economies thing, and compared it to dealerships over on the other end with the early diseconomies. Does this has nothing to do with the charts, but it's just kind of a general question. Does the entrance of companies like Tesla, which owns their own dealership, change that function? Or even I don't remember their names, these Carvana, and Automax and all that, which are becoming national dealerships, change the picture at all?
Presumably. I don't know enough about them, but as I said, what usually drives the shapes of these things are the underlying production or the underlying technologies and resources that are available. So if, for a long time, you had car dealerships that did tend to be independently owned. And I used to also use the example of dentists, because it seemed like dentists was you'd really only have one, if you saw a dentist's office, it was usually just owned by one person. You wouldn't have like one dentist that would own 3 or 4 dentist offices around town. But now they are having more franchises, I guess, of that has dental offices like that. So, yeah, I think that things must be changing in those industries. I don't know enough about them, but things must be changing where, for car dealerships, maybe it is becoming, at least for some of them who are willing to adopt this new model, maybe they're willing to, their adoption of that model means that they've discovered a way to kind of push that that minimum point of the long run average cost curve out to the right. So if you can imagine this point on the long run average cost curve kind of getting pulled or pushed over in that direction to make it look more like this. So maybe
at what point going up the curve on the early side does it enter into the bigger company and switch over to the extended economies?
I mean, there's no real hard fast rule that, it's just going to depend on what you define as a small amount of output for a diseconomies type of industry versus a large amount of output for this extended economies. Again, I just use the example of barbershops, dentist offices, because most of the time those just seem to be,
right
places. The car dealerships, the aircraft producers, there's only a few of them and they're massive. So, I pick out the extremes just to show as examples of these things. Restaurants, is the restaurant industry, how is that shaped? Again, there's probably a mix of both. You get some restaurants that are kind of more mom and pop.
Well, you've got a lot of mom and pops, but you also have a lot of franchises that are pretty national, especially in the takeout, the fast foods, the pizzas, the McDonald's.
Yeah, so there's probably, you could probably even call those two things different products, really. You have fast food restaurants, and even though they're a restaurant, just like a kind of a nice fancy sit-down restaurant, you can still put the label restaurant on both of them. But the underlying technologies that's used and the underlying way of managing the resources in both of those types of places is drastically different between the two. So they probably would have different pictures of their long-run average costs as well.
Okay, go ahead.
If you go back to slide 11, so just since we're on the same topic, why you're not working or producing at the minimum LAC, long run marginal cost, the LMC? Yeah, right here. Since it's the lowest, the minimum for marginal cost additional.
Yeah. Essentially the idea, and it might make a little more sense, is it next week? Let me see. Okay, yeah, so the second half of next week, when we get into competitive markets, we're going to talk about these businesses trying to maximize their profit, to make these profit maximizing output decisions, and they will look at their marginal costs. They're certainly going to care about their marginal cost curves, but when they're actually figuring out whether they are profitable or not, they look at their average costs. They look at the prices that they're charging compared to the average cost, because they're concerned with their total profit and how they maximize their total profit. A way that they can maximize their total. Well, I guess that's not quite right. I guess I'll go back to kind of what I said earlier, that these companies are thinking about their profitability on sort of the overall profitability of everything they're producing is more reflective of how their average costs are doing. Whether, their choice of, do we produce one more unit of output now? Do we produce the 301st unit of output? That's going to be when they're looking more at their marginal costs. But I don't know if I'm just confusing myself even more as I'm saying this. Economies of scale, diseconomies of scale. I guess you kind of couch it in these terms here, that whenever these average costs are falling, and I guess you could understand I can understand the confusion, because I mentioned here, when you're looking at these things, that we thought about teamwork phase, crowding phase by looking at the marginals.
Right.
But over here in the short term, they're thinking that way. In the long term, it's like, why are they only focusing on the averages? And I don't know if I can give any better answer than that. Again, in the long run, it's more of a planning sort of thing. So you're not really thinking about, we have to make this decision today about whether we want to produce more output or less output, whether we want to hire one more person or fire one more person. That's more of an immediate sort of decision. Again,
Okay,
they're looking at these average costs in terms of, in an overall sense, our average level of output, we're trying to figure out, we want to get to a point where that is minimized, where we're producing these products on average the cheapest that we can do. And you can kind of see that, I guess I'll stop there. I'm just confusing myself more and more as I talk about this.
It's just not matching up with the average cost.
Satisfying, but
it's just not matching up. Like when you look at the minimum average cost, that's what we're going to produce at. It's not matching up with the marginal cost, which is already a little bit higher than the minimum here, which is the most profitable, which is about like $2 and $3 there. But if you look at $3, it's not matching anything at all on average cost.
Over here, yeah. I'd have to go back. I mean, it's been so long since anyone's actually asked that question that I haven't had to think about it. I'd have to do more research to try to look into it and come up with a better answer for you than that.
All right, thank you.
I had a question on the assessment, the self-assessment this week.
Okay.
There was one question where you had a chart with two columns. I think it was quantity and total cost or something like that. Might have been something different, but there were only the two columns. And then you said complete the cost or complete the chart before going on to the rest of the question or the next questions. But there were no blanks in the chart. So I don't know what you meant. What were we supposed to complete if there was nothing blank?
Well, it might have been, and it's been a while since I've looked at those things too. It might have been a situation like either of these, where if all you had was the Q and the TCs, you should be able to have constructed these other two.
We had the output and the total cost.
Okay. Well, then you should be able to create these other ones too.
Well, which other ones? That's what I mean. There was.
Oh, sorry. I stopped my sharing.
There's 10 other columns that we could do, right?
If you have Q and TC, then you should be able to create these other two in the middle here that I was pointing at those, but I forgot that I turned my sharing off because I was going to pop out and look at the the quiz question itself. But
Oh, that's all. We didn't have to worry about the average total cost or the average
well, you could
the marginal cost or anything like that, or
you can generate all those too. If you start with Q and TC, you can pretty much make all of them. You can make columns of total fixed, total variable. You could also do all the averages and marginals too. I put them in two separate tables because I didn't want to make it would have been really squished.
yeah. Well, one of them had. There were two questions kind of like that, but one of them had blanks, so it was like, okay, yeah, I got to fill in the blanks. But the other one had no blanks, so I didn't know what we're supposed to actually do. But okay,
Can't say
So
too
it's
much
just-
because people are still able to take the self-assessment now. So I can't say.
okay.
Too much, but
Well, did I have any other questions on it? No, that's all I had. Fortunately, there were only a couple questions that followed it, so I kind of guessed at a couple, and I got most of them right.
as I said, if all you have is Q and TC, you should be able to create all of the rest. You should be able. I mean, if you have one that has a quantity of 0 in there, you should be able to create you should be able to know what the fixed costs are. You should be able to know what the variable costs are. And then you should be able to create all these others. You should be able to generate average total, average variable, and marginal cost by only starting with Q and TC. You should be able to create all of the rest of them. Just
Okay.
by of all these. Well, again, if you know when a quantity is 0, if you know what your total costs are, then producing 0 output, if that does incur some costs, those have to be all the fixed costs. So in the table here, when we produced 0 output, we had $6,000 of total cost. And since we don't have any variable expenses,
Can I see your screen?
those total costs must be fixed. And those must
I see. Okay. Yep, I get you. Okay, thank you.
All the time here. Then you could figure out, okay, if I know that it's 6,000, then I can figure out my variable cost. I think there's a practice problem that has you do something like this. So you should be able to create all of those. And then, again, you can go over to the not steering my screen anymore. Keep doing that. If you know that you're not producing anything and you have $6,000 of total cost, then you know that must be my fixed, and those have to be fixed. So that's why the fixed 6,000 keeps showing up. Then you can say, well, the total variable cost is the total cost minus those fixed costs. So all of these numbers are going to be the total variable costs plus the 6,000. So you can sort of back out what the variable costs are going to be. If you know what your total costs are, and you know your Q, you can figure out average total cost. It's just your total cost divided by Q. If you know your average variable cost, if you know your total variable cost, then you can calculate the average variable cost by taking TVC divided. And if you know an equation for marginal cost, like I gave you here, then you can figure out the marginal cost columns too. You can do kind of the cheating table way of figuring out marginal costs also if you don't have the equation. But you should be able to generate all 4 or 5 of those different ideas, the different concepts or variables, just from starting with the table of Q and TC.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Professor, the first problem in the text questions.
Let me see if I can get those. I think I downloaded them.
Yeah, here. So in the marginal product in the first, it should be 0 because I think you had it here at 40. Or did you just assume the first labor, he's the one who produced the 40, that's why you had the marginal product as 40?
Smaller. Make this font size bigger. So yeah, if you assume, well, I guess, yeah. When labor is 1, if the average product is 40, then you know that, again, the average is just the The average product is the total product divided by the number of workers. So if the average is 40, then you know the total must be the average times the number of workers. Mm-hmm. And if you're, again, the way that I'm calculating out marginal product here is by doing it in sort of I call it the cheating table way, because I don't have an equation for this. But I can, if I know that, again, marginal product is going to be the additional output that's produced by adding one more worker. So the assumption is that if I'm not using any workers at all, then there must be zero output. And if I have one more worker, and if I know that average product is 40, which means that total product is 40, then the output increased from 0 to 40 by adding that first worker. So I can actually put in a value for a marginal product for the first person. Because I know that, again, the output is increasing from 0 to 40 by adding that first person.
Or maybe it was already producing like 20 by a machine, and then the worker added 20, so it came up to 40. So just an assumption we have, right? Assumption we have, like, if there is nobody there, we have zero product coming up. Maybe there is a machine running in the background doing something without the worker.
Well, I guess our assumption too is that someone has to be making sure the machine is running. Someone has to turn it on. Make sure that electricity is still getting to it. So yeah, again, our assumption is usually that if there's no workers, then no output can be done. Because if you can still produce output with no workers, then you just wouldn't use any workers at all, right? You'd have zero labor all the time, and you produce as much output as to your heart's content. So yeah, our assumption is that if there's no workers, then there must not be anything being produced.
Okay. All right, and the same thing applies for the same question I have for the second problem, the marginal cost too. I think you had the same assumption. When you have 0Q, we have a total cost of 200, so that's why we had the marginal cost as business assumption for the second problem. Yeah.
Yeah, we're doing the same sort of thing with since I don't have an equation, I have to do the change in the cost from the previous row to what the new costs are in the current row. And so yes, even though I don't have it in here, I was able to make a zero row because I could figure out in the first row here that is given that the total fixed costs are $200 because the total cost is $260, and if I know the variable cost is $60, then the total fixed cost must be $200. So I could presume that if we're not producing any output at all, then the company would still have to pay those fixed costs. So I can even back up a step and say, when Q is 0, then there must be $200 of fixed costs still and $200 of total cost because I'm not using any workers. So yeah, the total variable cost would be 0 there. But you could still even though there's no row above the table above 100 in this table, you can still kind of guess what that would be, and then you can say, well, again, total cost went from 200 to 260. So that was an increase of 60 units when our output increased from 0 to 100. So the marginal cost there would be, again, the difference in total cost divided by the difference in output, or a marginal cost of 0.6.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
No, thank you very much.
Sure.
Take care. Have a great night.
You too. Does anyone have any input into why I think I told you guys we moved about a month ago, and I have this printer over here that is connected to our Wi-Fi network. And it used to be that I could print from any computer in the house, or I could print from my phone, just tell it to print off here. Now, we haven't changed, we've changed the modem, obviously, but we still have I've got everything connected to the network. I've got my phone connected to the network, and the printer is connected to the network because I can use this computer to print to the printer that's over there. It's connected wirelessly. There's no wire going from this computer to the printer. But suddenly we're not able to print from anywhere else. My phone can't print to the wireless printer. My laptop's not able to do it. So I'm baffled as to why that suddenly decided to not work. So my wife's asking me to print something for her, and I've got to do it on this computer. But it would be nice to not have to do that.
So Professor Shaughnessy, it's not picking up the printer's not picking up the command from the phone or the computer?
No, I mean, even when I tell even like I've got a little PDF here in my email, and
Yeah.
I tell it to print. This is all iPhone.
And is the printer is that setting the Wi-Fi setting set up on the printer so that you okay?
Yeah, because like the computer I'm using for this Zoom session, I can print that all day, and that's, like I said, it's wirelessly connected to the print, even though it's 2 feet away. It's still wirelessly connected to that printer. So I know that the Wi-Fi is working on the printer. It's just not working with any of the other devices that it used to work with.
Yeah,
I had the same problem with my printer, and I just restarted it. I just turned it off and turned it back on.
Yeah.
And it was working because it was working from my laptop and it wasn't printing from my phone. I had the same exact problem. I just restarted the printer, and I think it worked fine with me. So to try that, I'm not sure.
Well, I had to unplug it a couple of days ago because we put carpet in here, so I had to move it out. So it's been unplugged even for a whole day, and plugged it back in. Okay. Not doing it because I tried printing out something else this afternoon. And it seemed to just be when we changed when we moved and we got the new wire, the new modem and everything, that something is off. So I'll have to do some more snooping. It's not like I'm going to give you guys any extra credit for that problem. I would appreciate it if you guys had any input into it. If someone was like, you just do this and this, then that would be good. And I'm sure it is probably a solution like that. Anything else from either of you?
I think I asked all my questions.
Okay. Well, you guys don't have to stick around. I'll keep the Zoom session open though until the official 10:15 time. But you don't feel like you have to stick around if everything is answered.
Okay. All right. Great. Thank you so much, Professor. Have a good night.
Probably stop.
Thank you, Professor. Good night.
Thank you. Pause the recording.